When we dive into the past of ancient Rome, it's impossible not to confront one of the most extreme examples of the psychology of power, Caligula. A man surrounded by unimaginable luxury and a court entirely molded to his pleasure, who eventually became a shadow of absolute corruption. But behind the apparent madness, there is a mechanism. Power, when isolated, creates its own rituals, its own monsters, its own games. And this is the game we're going to talk about. The Roman throne, especially during the Principate, was a space where intimacy and domination fused together. The imperial court wasn't just a place for political decisions. It was a psychological stage, where every gesture, every look, every silence carried weight. Around Caligula, these dynamics intensified. To many, he seemed like an irrational tyrant, but in reality, he deeply understood the emotional machinery of submission. His behavior, no matter how cruel or absurd it appeared, had a purpose: to preserve his image as the absolute center of the Roman universe. The key lies in the human heart. When you control the fear and desire of those around you, you control everything. Caligula knew this. He used closeness to break resistance. Endless feasts, theatrical displays, lust, public humiliations, arbitrary choices. By placing everyone on an emotional tightrope, he kept his court dependent. This wasn't just debauchery, it was engineered power. Under this system, no one ever knew what to expect. And when the unexpected becomes the rule, the ruler reigns. This is the same logic used by authoritarian leaders throughout history, and Caligula was light years ahead in understanding it. Intimacy was his weapon. Turning private moments into public demonstrations of control was his psychological signature. And those who orbited around him became pieces of an emotional chessboard that never stopped moving. The court didn't just witness political decisions, it witnessed desires, impulses, and crossed humiliations. And that changed everything. At any moment, the emperor could elevate a nobody or destroy an entire family. When the future becomes unpredictable, the present becomes a maze. And in that maze, Caligula was the only one who held the map. That's why his story is still fascinating. It reveals something about ourselves. How far a human being can go when no one ever says no. How the mind reacts when power becomes an extension of the ego. And how entire empires can be reshaped by the psychology of a single individual. Caligula didn't create this system, he simply lived it to its extreme. And by doing so, he left behind a frightening portrait of how intimacy, when turned into a tool of the state, can drive a world into delirium. His life is more than a strange chapter in Roman history. It's an eternal study of human nature, and the abyss that waits for us when we confuse power with glory. The hall is a bowl of torchlight and polished marble. Wine steams in goblets, laughter fills the space like a trained echo, and somewhere beyond the curtained alcoves, a harp strings out an obliging tune. You are seated close enough to feel the heat of the emperor's robe. He moves through his guests with a slow, theatrical kindness. Light fingers on shoulders, a voice that promises trivia and ruin in the same breath. Then he points, and the room tightens as if a net has been drawn. A woman rises where she had been sitting with the dignity of a wife or sister. The emperor names her a goddess in the same sentence he names her disgrace. You watch men bend their heads not from fear of law, but from the weight of spectacle. In the same motion that crowns, he shreds honor. If this examination of power unsettles you, like and subscribe. There are more of these blueprints to uncover about how cruelty becomes rule. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus did not emerge from nowhere. He carried a childhood of pageantry and loss, a nickname that shrank him into a toy for a family's ambitions. Sons and daughters paraded in armor, the imperial household kept its own ceremonies and its own cruelties. The man who would be called Caligula learned early that visibility was a tool. When his father and brothers died, when whispers of poison and plot coalesced into a household shaped by fear, what remained was a pattern. Grief braided with performance. Grief that could be shown to others as spectacle. He spent years under the shadow of Tiberius. Years that scholars still read as formative, as the slow forging of a ruler who knew both the public language of ritual and the private grammar of humiliation. Ancient sources report that an illness in the first months of his reign changed him further. Historians debate whether it was fever, a neurological event, or the unleashing of a temperament finally freed from restraint. What matters for the machine that followed is not the precise diagnosis, but the mechanism. The private wound translated into a public strategy. He would convert family, sex, law, ceremony, and pity into instruments. The palace became the workshop for a blueprint of domination. First, the sister goddess. You are in a room smelling faintly of myrrh and the citrus smoke that Capri's kitchens always seem to wear. Drusilla moves like someone who knows the world is watching her for reasons that she did not choose. Ancient sources report that Caligula elevated his sister to divine status, a declaration that folded private relationship into public theology. Suetonius paints it as excess. Tacitus hints at political calculation. Whether the acclaim was performed devotion or an instrument of control, the effect was the same. Kinship turned into a weapon. By insisting that family be seen and fetishized, the emperor rewired social bonds. Men who once measured themselves by honor now measured themselves by proximity to the imperial theater. Women in the family were no longer relatives, but instruments of imperial identity. The sanctity of kinship became legible as spectacle. The psychological mechanism is simple and cruel. If the ruler can lay claim to the sacredness of your nearest ties, he forces everyone to reorient their loyalties publicly and privately. The ledger of intimacy is rewritten with his name at the top. Second, the palace as brothel. Imagine a corridor where the stone still holds the stain of water, where servants fold themselves into shadow and listen. A summons arrives, and you find that the private rooms of the household have been declared open to the emperor's whims. Ancient reports claim that the palace was used to procure bodies and obedience for public amusement. Historians disagree on the scale and motive, but the formula is consistent across sources. Sex turned into administrative act. This is not only about desire, it is bureaucracy. Marriage vows and familial sanctity are stripped away as if they were forms to be stamped. The mechanism here is bureaucratic humiliation. Make sexual submission an item on the ruler's ledger. Record it. Enforce it through patronage and penalty. The consequence is social corrosion. When the apparatus of consent is replaced by order, the bonds that hold private life intact fray. Men who once could call upon reputation to protect their families find their reputations auctioned off to the highest imperial whim. Intimacy becomes currency. Currency buys compliance. Third, the theater of public degradation. Picture the banquet stretched into the night, platters cleared, but eyes still fixed. You watch as a senator's wife is summoned to stand, and as a laughter like a small animal rises and is stifled because no one can meet another's eye. Ancient sources report that the emperor staged scenes of sexual spectacle to shame the elite and to recalibrate the balance between public respectability and imperial power. Tacitus and Suetonius, writing decades later, offered different tones. One sober, one scandalized, but both return to the same image, civility turned inside out. The psychological operation here is humiliation as weapon. By forcing respectable people into exposure, the ruler demonstrates the fragility of the social contract. Men who have built their lives on reputation discover that reputation is a thin glass. One gesture from the sovereign will shatter it. The societal consequence is deterrence. Private resistance becomes too costly, when the cost is the public unmaking of a family standing. These first three blueprints cluster around a single innovation: convert the intimate into statecraft. The machine now has a recognizable casing, registers of scandal to be consulted, rituals to be performed, and punishments to be meted not by law but by spectacle. But the engine turns on more gears. Fourth, punishment through sexualized penalty. You are in the narrow corridor where the praetorians passes and herd steps grow nearer. The accusation is a rumor at first, an estate confiscated, a son removed from his legions. Then it is a sentence, humiliation as sanction. Ancient narratives record episodes where sexual humiliation, or the threat of it, was used as a punishment for political offenders and perceived enemies. Historians caution that reports differ in detail and intention. Even so, the underlying pattern is a clear tactic. Sexualized punishment substitutes for legal process and functions as a visible example to others. The psychological mechanism is double-edged. It dehumanizes both the punished and the onlookers. The punished person is stripped of dignity. The onlooker learns that law is not impartial but performative, up for the sovereign's signature. The societal consequence deepens compliance and disables dissent. When state violence is personalized into acts that scar reputation and body, communities learn to police themselves out of fear. Fifth, the appropriation of piety and ceremony for private gratification. In temples and rites where people once sought solace, declarations were made that blurred the line between civic religion and imperial indulgence. Some ancient accounts hold that Caligula demanded rites be altered to serve his personal aims, even to the point of declaring divine honors. Whether these were sincere acts of belief or cynical displays of power, the result was similar. Religious life turned into another ledger entry. The mechanism sacralized the ruler to monopolize moral language. The consequence is the hollowing of communal moral frameworks. If the governor of piety is also its greatest violator, the moral grammar of society collapses under contradiction. People grow adept at living in two languages: public compliance and private moral dissonance, a habit that survives administrations and becomes an institution of its own. At each turn, the machine makes record: the naming, the proclamation, the stripped testimony. It trains not only a solitary tyrant, but an apparatus: servants who obey, scribes who file, guards who execute. It teaches roles and replicates them. The blueprint is not chaotic, it is methodical. Caligula's few years on the throne gave the mechanism time enough to test itself. He cultivated performative unpredictability, alternating between generosity and terror, and thus kept his circle off balance. He thrust favors like bait, then punished those who took them, as if the very act of gratitude implied complicity. The Praetorian Guard became both protector and instrument. The Senate became a stage and a target. Family anguish, real and performed, was used to recalibrate loyalties, making private grief an index of public favor. Resistance gathered as quietly as breath before a shout. Among the Praetorians, a private resentment burned. Among senators, the old codes of honor and revenge reasserted themselves in whispers and glances. Cassius Charia, a tribune with scars from mockery and a name that would be remembered for its single fatal act, kept his anger in a pocket until the moment opened. The assassination, when it came, was sudden and surgical. The narrative leaps forward into clipped measures. The narrow corridor, the glint of steel, the surprise of the guards, the body's collapse. For a brief instant, the machine hiccuped. The spectacle that had been its power dissolved into the raw fact of death. The aftermath did not return Rome to innocence. Retributions were swift. Those closest to the fallen ruler were killed or exiled, and the state scrambled to seal the breach with authority and order. But the more lasting effect lay elsewhere. The patterns Caligula had institutionalized did not die with him. They echoed in later reigns, variants and repeats in Nero's theatrics, Domitian's paranoia, Commodus's performative violence. The lessons hardened into traditions of governance, spectacle, humiliation, the use of intimacy as leverage. Institutions, once taught to accept these tools, kept them in their armory. Power had learned a new language, and the grammar persisted. If you have followed the shapes of these offenses, you see that their horror is not merely the acts themselves, but the systemization of violation. How private wrong becomes public ordinance, how intimacy is turned into a bureaucratic item. That is the blueprinted cruelty, repeatable, teachable, and portable. It survives regimes because it can be passed along as technique. Ancient historians differ on specifics, and modern scholars sift the sources with caution. Suetonius offers anecdotes that are vivid and scandalous. Tacitus frames events with political skepticism. Cassius Dio supplies a broader chronological sweep. When claims verge on the grotesque, the best account is humility. Report the testimony, mark the dispute, and return to the mechanics. The goal is not to titillate, but to map the ways in which authority weaponizes what should have protected the human person: the family, the law, ritual, reputation. There is a final, chilling arithmetic to all of this. A single act of humiliation is damage to one life. A system that thrives on humiliation damages a society's capacity for trust. Once the ledger of private rights is marked by public ownership, people begin to perform their own captivity. They placate, they betray one another in anticipatory defense. They teach their children to avert their eyes. The machine ceases to be a novelty and becomes habit. Yet, habit is not inevitability. Recognition is the first tool against repetition. To study the mechanisms, to name the 5 acts, to understand the ledger, to trace who benefits and who carries the cost, is to disarm the novelty that makes cruelty look irresistible. The historian's duty is not only to recount horror, but to reveal pattern, to turn a scandal into a lesson.
Another defensive line is the distribution of honor. Cruelty often exploits concentration. When a single man's whim is the sole source of elevation and disgrace, every relationship becomes a bargaining chip. Institutions that distribute the means of honor, public benefactions administered through civic liens, municipal magistracies held in rotation, honors tied to office rather than to favor, create multiple centers of prestige. Patrons then have less power to convert private bonds into instruments of state terror because those bonds have alternative channels of reinforcement. It is no accident that antiquity's more stable centuries were those in which municipal aristocracies and senatorial networks retained visible roles in local life. They made the machine of power less monolithic and therefore less able to monopolize the grammar of humiliation. The military itself must be governed by rules that deny it the role of household executor. The Praetorian Guard under successive emperors became both protector and political actor. Their proximity to the sovereign made them a danger and a tool. Restraining such bodies requires law and culture, clear chains of command, rotating stations, accountability through annalistic record, and above all the cultivation of military loyalty to office rather than person. Where legions and guards see their wage, honor, and meaning tied to the person of a ruler, they will inevitably be enlisted into acts of private vengeance and public theater. When their discipline is bound to the state as an abstraction, when their honors derive from the defense of laws and frontiers rather than the courtesies of a palace, then they resist becoming instruments of humiliation. There is also the moral economy of patronage to be considered. Freedmen and favorites operate as the delivery system of humiliation because they obscure responsibility. The hand that wounds is intermediate, the face of authority hidden. Transparency in administration, the naming of decision-makers, public record of edicts and their sponsors, the ritualization of audiences returns the visible name to the center. When decisions are recorded and the chain of counsel is known, responsibility becomes traceable. Men cannot easily make a person perform the role of scapegoat if every command is a matter of public record. The cult of secrecy is central to the success of cruelty as technique. The antidote is the dusting of secrets into the light. Yet the remedies are not solely procedural. There must be a cultural refusal to accept humiliation as pedagogy. Caligula's innovations succeeded in part because humiliation was reconceptualized as spectacle and education. To resist, an ethical counter-narrative is required. A public language that makes private refuge sacred, that names the boundary between public duty and family honor, that stigmatizes the conversion of affection into currency. Such languages develop slowly. They emerge in law, in the writings of moralists, in funerary inscriptions that mark what a man or woman was owed in private. When moralists like Seneca or historians like Tacitus accuse excess and expose its mechanisms, they provide society with the vocabulary to recognize, and therefore to resist, the weaponization of intimacy. Memory and the careful telling of what tyranny does to people is itself a civic tool. There are, tragically, limits to what law and rhetoric can achieve. Power learns. Techniques migrate, mutate, and find new vessels. The long shadow cast by a reign of terror is a practical problem. Disciplines can be enacted, but then subverted. The tendency of institutions to imitate what succeeds means that the new grammar of governance can be reinscribed in different hands. Some later emperors who practiced cruelty did so with more polished procedure. They replaced the raw theatricality of Caligula with bureaucratic routines that achieved the same ends more effectively. That evolution demonstrates the necessity of vigilance. Reforms must be durable and adaptable, for the methods of domination will not stay fixed. Finally, there is the role of memory and sanctions. Empires are not policed solely by courts, but also by reputational economies. The fear, not of physical reprisal, but of lasting infamy, deters many abuses. Historians and moralists who record and circulate narratives of shame perform a public function. They extend the penalties of wrongdoing beyond the reach of immediate authority, into the ledger of posterity. The risk for an abuser is not merely sudden death, but the slow corrosion of remembrance, the way a name becomes synonymous with vice. That deterrent is uneven. Some men care little for memory, but as a cultural instrument it has power. The practice of commemorating victims, of writing laws that treat certain abuses as crimes against the social fabric, and of embedding censure into ritual practice, these are forms of social memory that widen the field of accountability. To speak plainly, the machinery of domination can be unmade only by a combination of legal structure, dispersed prestige, transparent administration, disciplined military culture, and public moral formation. None of these measures are revolutionary in themselves. They are conservative in the best sense. They conserve the conditions of private dignity against the appetites of spectacle. That conservatism must be active. It is not enough to reimpose old forms. One must also educate new custodians to recognize the signs of conversion. The moment when an argument about loyalty becomes a command to betray a child. When a court summons is the prelude to ritual humiliation. The historian's map, then, is also a manual for prevention. Name the technique, and you name the counter-technique. There is a further irony that history must not gloss over. The very resilience of systematized cruelty is occasioned by those who would secure stability by handing more latitude to power. In the desire for peace, for orderly succession, for administrative efficiency, republics and empires have sometimes ceded ethical boundary lines. The lesson is disquieting. Reforms that centralize to prevent disorder can, if insufficiently safeguarded, create instruments that later turn that centralization into arbitrariness. Thus, the political ideal of unity must always be married to robust institutions that preserve private refuge and public process. When we close the ledger on Caligula and his imitators, we recover a sober obligation for any polity that seeks to last. To teach its governors how power is to be held and how it must not be used.
To do so requires the labor of lawyers, the steadfastness of magistrates, the discipline of soldiers, the courage of senators and civic elites, and the vigilance of memory makers, historians, moralists, epigraphists who refuse easy forgetting. The catalog of abuses that began in a palace corridor can be served with countermeasures in market square and courthouse alike, if those public places retain their rights to speak and judge. And yet, even as these defenses are listed, the historian must concede a final humility. Institutions are made of people, and people are changeable. Prevention is an ongoing work, not a single decree. The question we close upon, more practical than rhetorical, is this: who will practice that ongoing work? Who will teach successors that the seduction of humiliation is a danger to order itself? And who will bind the uses of power to laws and rituals that preserve the margin where private life remains inviolate? The answer is not only in statutes and Senate rolls, but in the daily practices of magistrates, in the education of officers, in the insistence of civic speech that names abuse for what it is. If those small, ordinary acts are neglected, then technique will again find its instrument. If they are practiced, then even the most theatrical sovereign will find his stage reduced, and the ledger of society will keep its own account. The room of the historian closes, for now, on that ledger, on the recurring arithmetic whereby private injury becomes public method, and by which method is either perpetuated or undone. There remain, in the margins of law and the margins of memory, the raw materials of repair, testimony, procedure, ritual, and the slow work of reputational consequence. It is to those materials that a polity must return if it would turn scandal into lesson and horror into a check upon future appetite. The narrative does not end with a single death. It persists in the choices after, in the wills that insist upon protecting family and law against the theater of power. The next pages must ask who, in the years that follow, will take up that work, and by what means they will succeed or fail. The room of the historian closes, for now, on that ledger, on the recurring arithmetic whereby private injury becomes public method, and by which method is either perpetuated or undone. There remain, in the margins of law and the margins of memory, the raw materials of repair, testimony, procedure, ritual, and the slow work of reputational consequence. It is to those materials that a polity must return if it would turn scandal into lesson and horror into a check upon future appetite. The narrative does not end with a single death. It persists in the choices after, in the wills that insist upon protecting family and law against the theater of power. The next pages must ask who, in the years that follow, will take up that work, and by what means they will succeed or fail.
Subscribe now and turn on notifications to receive more deep, hidden, and unsettling stories from the past. Stories most people prefer to forget, but that reveal who we really are.